Well, hello again, everybody, and welcome to another podcast of Tyrannus Hall. And this is a place where we're having discussions as we try to make the mission of Jesus Christ every Christian's passion and every church's mission. And today we have the privilege of speaking to a bunch of gentlemen from Refuge Church in Langley, British Columbia. And we want to talk with them a little bit about what does it look like to start a church and try to be really missionally orientated. And then specifically, how do you follow the leading and the opportunities of the Holy Spirit as he presents them to you as you embark on this kind of great adventure? So today, joining us on the podcast, of course, there's Bill DeYoung, my co-host, and then we have with us Randall Visscher, Pastor Randall Visscher from Refuge Church, and then Mike Vandergugten and Jerome Lenkeek, who are going to be filling us in on what's going on in Refuge. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So maybe one of you gentlemen can help us start off by just giving us a little bit of background about the origins of Refuge Church. How did this church start? Where did it come from?
Well, I could probably answer to that one since I was kind of there with the first one to get tapped on the shoulder. It wasn't my idea. There was a sister in the church in Langley who just wrote an email to a bunch of folks that thought might be interested in a more outreach-focused, missionally minded church. And that was back in, I think, the end of 2016. And we did a bunch of grassroots committee stuff involving, well, at the time, the group was basically just some younger folk with a few older folk. I suppose I might be in that category compared to the people I was with. But yeah, we did seek some advice from other older, wiser members of the church, some elders. We did end up getting a bit of help along the way, and through a bunch of different back and forths, different ideas, with the idea of pursuing the model of a satellite church through Langley Community Reformed Church, that in the end, it was not fully supported as the best way. So then we pursued just instituting church as its own separate entity. And that was July 12th, 2020 was the date and institution.
So Mike, you're saying that the idea germinates from an email from a sister in the congregation who says, hey, do this. Is there anything else going on? Like a lot of times in Canadian Reformed churches, it ends up being, hey, we've reached X amount of members. Maybe we need to start a new church. Was there any of that going on in the background, or was this just simply a sister who was like, hey, let's do something. Let's start a new church?
Yeah. So I served on the home mission committee with her at one point. And I wasn't really, hanging out with her or whatever, friends, whatever, just friendly. And so she was with, I think, another small group in the church, that actual small group, not just like a small group of people, but this was like their meeting every couple of weeks to discuss the Bible and whatever. And they had kind of talked about it. And then I kind of felt like I got tapped on the shoulder out of the blue. I'm like, yeah, I'd be behind that. I'd be interested to explore. But it was never really a conversation of, hey, our church is too big, let's start a new one. It's part of the matrix of that all. The benefit of having a smaller church was, part of the conversation, but it was kind of a small player in the whole mindset of that. It was more like, what can we do to share the gospel with people, to remove barriers while still remaining faithful to the Reformed confessions and to the Canadian Reformed way of doing things. And yeah, it just, as we talked and went along, then we found some help. And
Mike, if I could interject here, I think our listeners who are part of established confessionally Reformed churches, whether Canadian Reformed or United Reformed, would be interested to know at what point this process became formal. Did you at some point establish a steering committee or a launch team or some kind of group that began to meet to plot out this new church?
Yeah, so it was probably in mid or maybe in spring 2017. Got a group together. There was a couple of fellow parishioners who were elders or had been elders in the past, who were interested. And then we ended up sending an email or a letter to our council looking to kind of see if we can get some guidance on this. And they said, yeah, just keep in touch. And yeah, just.
And then Mike, how did you invite people to be part of this? Was that correspondence that went to all the members of the Langley Church, or did you approach individuals and say, hey, would you be interested in a new kind of church? How did that work? How did you build your initial congregation?
Right. So there was a bit of discussion. The email gets sent to me, and I'm like, oh, sweet. I think these people and these people might be interested. She's like, well, maybe we should just start small and get something, a bit of groundwork, framework about what this is actually going to look like, because you have way too many cooks in the kitchen, so to speak, that you can end up feel like you're spinning your wheels. But along the way, I can't remember if specifically, I do have all my paperwork here, but at some point along the way, later that year, 2017, I think, or maybe 2018, with our council's, Langley Council's knowledge and approval, sending out basically a net saying, hey, this is kind of what we're looking to do. Who would be interested? And then we had, I think even later in the 2018, basically a small survey, who would be interested, maybe or no, who would be interested in this model. And yeah, that was kind of what got it kind of kickstarted.
So, I introduced this, this conversation in terms of following the leading of the Spirit, or the opportunities that the Spirit gives us. And so already, I think this is just such a wonderful story. You have a sister in the congregation who's like, you know what I would love to see, and I write an email, and look what's happened. Now you guys got a church, like, that's amazing. So, already for our listeners, in terms of like, hey, if you've got a passion for something, you've got, something weighing on your heart, well, follow that good biblical, spiritual leading, and talk to people about it, and, see where it goes. That's just a beautiful thing. So now you're getting people together. I know that from the beginning, and especially when you decided as a congregation that you would have an overall outreach orientation.
Yeah.
So I'm interested on what did that agreement look like? Like, was this something, did you guys make a covenant together? Did you spell it all out and have people sign on the dotted line? Like, what does it mean for a new church to say, we all agree to have an outward orientation? Like, was a requirement to become a member? Like, what did that actually look like?
Yeah. So part of that comes from being inspired by, just a new way of looking at the way we do church. Nothing like super way out there, depending who you talk to. But the idea came from Blessings, thanks to Bill DeYoung and the Unfolken Ontario, who started the church. And then we leaned on some of the material from Blessings to come up with a structure and, vision and mission statement. Yeah, I don't know, maybe you want to say a little bit more about that, Jerome?
Yeah, I can also answer something that Winston was, I think, asking after a little bit too, which is on that process and how that unfolded. I came into the committee around the 2018, 2019 timeframe, when there was actually a bit of a shift in terms of who is on this steering committee looking to start the church. And basically what the main reason for the switch was, that was the end of the period in which Langley was looking at potentially starting a satellite or second campus, or doing a more traditional church split, almost even over geographic lines in some way. And then there was a switch to thinking of this more just as a institution of a new, completely separate church. And at that transition point, we called a couple of meetings with any members of the congregation in Langley who were interested in this new concept. And that's at the point where I joined the steering committee as well. A number of the other members who were with Mike from the beginning left. I think the turning of the big wheel of church orderly process can be a bit wearying sometimes, especially for regular members who hadn't had council experience. And so I think there was a little bit of a transition in the committee. About half of the members were replaced with new ones. And so I came in at that point. We had a couple of congregational meetings, and then there was some feedback from the group there, going to Winston's question, where I think it was heard quite loud and clear from people that the similar outreach, missional minded focus to what some people had experienced when visiting Blessings was the general direction that we wanted to go. And then, in a second meeting, things were taking shape a bit more. The committee did some more work and research, looked at that, shared some documents with the whole group of people that were potentially interested in joining the new church plant. And that's where really we started to get some focus on what this congregation would potentially look like.
I'm kind of curious, Jerome, Mike, and perhaps even Randall can weigh in. What did that look like specifically for Refuge when you launched? So there's a commitment to being missional, to be outreach oriented. I imagine to some extent Langley was, and yet you upped the ante. What were the kinds of things that you were committed to from the outset that may have represented a change, however slight, from your previous church experience?
There's a few different things, and maybe Mike, you can add a couple more, but one that actually jumps to mind that you wouldn't normally think of is having a bit more of a push to really be involved in outreach. And so I say that's maybe what you wouldn't expect, because the impression I've heard from some people in talking about the concept of an outreach focused church is that there's concern or expectation that the type of people who join are all the ones who were maybe involved in a home mission committee before, who are really very active in reaching out to their neighbors. And so they want to be a part of an outreach church. But what I actually found was more the case, and to a large extent, that was the case with me. And I heard this even more clearly with another friend of mine who is a member of Refuge now. And the way he put it was that in a very large church, he felt quite comfortable leaning against the back wall and not really doing a lot of and he was just more focused on his professional life and his family. And he was an active member of church, but nobody ever tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Hey, could you join this group and help with this?" Or, "Hey, have you ever talked to your neighbors about the gospel? Are you sharing the good news with people at work?" And so that's kind of the mindset that I had and a few other people had, is it would actually be good for us to be a part of a church where people ask those questions of each other. And I felt like I would be a more faithful member of the church and really living out my calling as a Christian to share the good news of Jesus Christ if I was in a group of people who really encouraged me to live that way fully. So that's kind of one of the interesting aspects of what it means to be a part of Refuge, is that we really try to encourage each other in many ways through Pastor Randall's preaching, through our small group Bible studies, and through all the teams that we have. We're always asking that question, like, how are you helping to spread the gospel message? So, yeah, I don't know if you others maybe want to give some of the more upfront ways, but that's a background or psychological element that I've been reflecting on a bit.
I think I could add a bit of context. There was nobody in this grassroots committee, which is like a group of people. We weren't appointed by anybody, but none of us were coming at it with like, Langley sucks and I really don't like any of these people are bothering me and whatever. There was no disgruntledness. There was no, griping or whatever. It was just like, hey, we want to do a good job of this. And at some point, how are we going to achieve aiming for a more outreach focus when there's, at the time there was like 780 members in the church? How do you unify people to something like this? Well, we figured after, the whole way the Lord led us through this was, instead of trying to turn the cruise ship with a lot of people in it to, turn a small boat. That's kind of the beauty of having a fresh start with everybody on board, that it just makes it easier to have.
Well, I do think that smaller congregations, when I say smaller, 200 and under, are in some ways much better suited to be missional, precisely for some of the reasons you've mentioned. You can mobilize everyone, and as a church grows beyond 200, you're going to find more people content to have their back against the wall, to invoke the imagery that Jerome used earlier. So I think just a smaller church is in some ways more adept at being missional, simply because you have a better chance at mobilizing people. But let me ask Randall, so you came on the scene part way, and to what extent has your ministry changed coming to Refuge, or has it stayed exactly the same? Are there lessons that you're learning in this process, having migrated from a more established Canadian Reformed church? What conclusions are you reaching? What observations are you making? Is there any sense in which your ministry is evolving in this new context in which you find yourself?
Yeah, I'd say, like, for me, it's been a pretty dramatic change, and that's for a whole variety of factors. You know, the outreach orientated perspective is definitely a shift. You know, in my previous congregation in Grand Valley, like, we were certainly concerned about outreach. It was something that was talked about, but there was perhaps more of a sense of you wouldn't necessarily change the way you would do something for the sake of outreach. Like, that might play into it, but it wouldn't necessarily be probably a primary concern. There was a sense of kind of like, yeah, you first thought about, okay, how does this impact our members who are presently here? And if this happens to kind of benefit those who might come into church, great. But yeah, you know, I think the idea to change something just to appeal to those perhaps outside the church would be viewed suspect. Whereas, yeah, in Refuge, it's not that we constantly change things just to appeal. Like, we always consider, how does it also impact our members? But yeah, it's definitely more front and center in the way we do things, the changes we've made, the things we've done. You know, does this make it easier for someone new to join us in worship? You know,
Randall, can you expand on that? Like, flesh that out a little bit from your perspective as a pastor. What does it mean that Refuge Church is outreach orientated? So, can you sort of paint a picture of what that means for you? You know, if someone comes up to you and be like, "Hey, yeah, I'm thinking of joining Refuge Church. I heard it's outreach orientated. What does that mean?" How would you go about explaining that?
I guess I'd say, like, yeah, if you want to join Refuge as a member, it's like, just recognize that as a church, we front and center in our minds want to be reaching out to our neighbors, and we want to worship the Lord in a way which is also very understandable to our neighbors. Lives beside you to church, even if they've never been to a church before. And yes, it will still be strange. Like, worship is always going to be a bit strange for someone who's never worshiped before. But when it comes to a lot of the language, you know, that is, say, used in a worship service, you know, we try to avoid, you know, the churchy's, the biblicalisms, or at least kind of translate them after we use them. Yeah, it means that, like, there's an expectation that if you're a member here, if you see, you know, people who are new, that you don't just kind of leave it off to the next person to maybe greet that person, but that every single person recognizes their Christian calling to reach out to those around them. And that's whether they're at home or at church or in any environment. Yeah.
I'm interested how something like diaconal work plays into that. Like, if you think about being outreach orientated, evangelism, right, diaconal work, like, how does those things mesh together? How do they work in Refuge?
Well, here's one example.
How would you like them to work?
At Refuge, we don't do collections for the needy. We do collections for causes of the month. And these causes of the month are causes within our community. Some of them have maybe a bit more of a religious angle. So something like prison ministries, M2W. Some of them, yeah, it might be a little less explicit, like supporting the Langley Food Bank. And so, like, if you come to Refuge in our worship service, when we're talking about, you know, the offering that's there, that people are kind of invited to participate in, that is all going towards the community. We're not asking anything for ourselves, because we never want to give the visitor the impression that, oh, church is just about them asking for your money. You know, they want you to donate to them, you know? So, like, we will, you know, support our church budget and collect money for the needs within our own congregation, but we'll primarily do that electronically. And in the worship service itself, if anyone comes in, if they give money, they can know that money is going to support not just our church and our people there, but people in the community around us at large. And they're getting to share with us in that love of the community of Langley and the wider greater Vancouver area.
Okay, so I got a question that I wasn't going to ask, but I'm just going to ask it. So the things that you guys are explaining it doesn't sound too radical. You're talking about, hey, let's create a community where we really actively, intentionally encourage each other and help each other. share the gospel with others, where we're willing to tweak certain things and language, et cetera, in order to reach out to people. And that a lot of this, at least in the beginning, was modeled by some of your experiences with Bill's church, with Blessing. So in the Canadian Reformed context, Bill, your church is in a little corner of Ontario, but it's been a bit of a pioneer church in terms of trying to be actively missional. And that can, the name Blessings can be good currency or bad currency, depending on who you're talking to. And so I'm wondering, in all of your guys' experience at Refuge Church, Mike, you mentioned the super important point that you weren't running away from church problems, or you weren't having a negative view of your home church. You're trying to do something new. That's so important. It wouldn't be, the Spirit leading this process if it wasn't like that.
Yeah.
And yet, Jerome, you mentioned, people having concerns. And so I'm wondering if you had any pushback, if you had any people that were afraid that you're trying to do something too radical or something, out of the ordinary. Sometimes I've talked to people who have heard, rumors of what happens at Blessings that's just totally not true. So yeah, I'm wondering whether or not you got any negative pushback from that. And then how did you deal with something like that? I think it's an important question for people listening to the podcast who might be interested in doing something like this, if they're gonna find themselves in a similar situation.
Right.
Perhaps surprisingly little. At least maybe we're not around that coffee table for obvious reasons. So there might be people who are concerned about it. There's a few different factors. One is simply timing. We started Refuge right as the pandemic was kicking off. And with worship restrictions, we haven't had as many kind of inter-Canadian Reformed Church visitors kicking the tires, if you will, coming out to check us out as you might have experienced otherwise. We've actually seen quite a few more in the last few weeks now that things are much more opened up in terms of attendance. But maybe a couple of questions here and there, but really haven't had a lot of strong opposition. I think only in terms of, just making sure before we were instituted that we were prepared to be a viable and successful congregation. So the kind of questions we got in terms of from advice from other local Canadian Reformed congregations before institution were things like, are you sure you have enough members to support things financially? Do you have a location figured out? It's a pretty challenging real estate market around here for not just residential, but also commercial and institutional space. So have you thought through all the practical matters? So I don't know, maybe Mike, you've heard more, or Pastor Randall, you might have had other questions, but we may also be because, we're not the first outreach focused Canadian Reformed Church. And it's been quite a few years since Blessing started, for example, that maybe people who had some concerns aren't, charging in with them. Hey, what's going on over here? This isn't an entirely new concept. And maybe there's a bit more of a wait and see if anyone did have some of their own personal concerns. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think we've had any number of other Canadian Reformed ministers now preach on our pulpits and, see up close and personal how things are done at Refuge. And I think generally, they've often come away quite positive about the experiences that they've had. And while we have changed things, I think we've done it quite carefully and thoughtfully. And so it's gone well.
Mm-hmm.
Bill, you want to chime in on any of that?
Yeah, sure. Well, a couple of things. I'm the pastor of Blessings, which especially in the past was at the center of some controversy, the object of a lot of concerns. I have to be honest, very rarely did people ever pick up the phone and talk to me or even send me an email. I heard about criticisms via, and I was always a little bothered by the fact that people just didn't bother to call me or send me an email or come and visit Blessings. And I think what you at Refuge are experiencing is what I've experienced. People have showed up at Blessings and have imagined something entirely different than what they experience. And, they go through a worship service and they say, oh, this is wonderful. You're not so different in the end from other Canadian Reformed churches. We see a lot of similarities, and in some sense, they're underwhelmed by the differences that people sometimes pretend are there. The other phenomenon that's really good for us is that churches like Refuge have started, because in some way it deflects some of the attention that Blessings has received justly or unjustly in the past. I mean, even if you look at our sister churches in Australia, an earlier synod wanted their ecumenical committee to monitor blessings in particular, and they came back to the next synod and they said, you know what? We realize that what's going on at Blessings is actually a federation-wide matter. There are a lot of questions that are being asked about the context in which churches find themselves. Many churches are endeavoring now to be missional in a way they weren't before. And our focus on Blessings was a little misplaced because it's a federation-wide conversation that's occurring. So that's been gratifying as well. But I often had this experience where people would come to Blessings and after worship say, well, that was wonderful. It really wasn't what I imagined it to be. And it made me just wonder what they imagined it would be. Yeah. In the end, we follow a Reformed liturgy. We sing psalms and biblical hymns. There's nothing in Reformed theology that I would flag as a deterrent to missions or an obstacle to missions. I'm quite fond of the church polity that we have in Canadian Reformed churches. There are very few articles that I'm interested in rewriting, maybe a couple of them. But for the most part, I love the polity that we have. I identify with the history. And I'm sure that's true for all of you as well. I don't need to check my Reformed convictions at the door to be a pastor of a missional church in Blessings.
I like how you put it, how it was underwhelming for people. So if you're going to go out and start a new missional church, try to make it underwhelming.
Like we actually had, we actually had a guest pastor who came and he was expecting, kind of not sure what to expect. And after doing the two services, the second one being with question and answer period, he was flowing like, this is wonderful. I was not sure what to expect with the worship, and it was reverent and God-pleasing and biblical. And I'm really encouraged to see this. So it was not underwhelming for him. It was more like overwhelming. And he was, we had many of our congregation members just saying, well, you can invite him back again. That went really well. So, it's not what it may not be what you expect. And it's a good thing.
Yeah, wonderful. Hey, gentlemen, let me shift gears here a little bit. You guys started Refuge Church. You got Randall as pastor now. You got, hopes and aspirations in terms of what the culture of the church is going to be and what people are doing in everyday lives. But then the Lord in his providence has thrown a really unique opportunity on the lap of the church. And you guys have, or you as a church have decided, hey, if the Spirit is opening this door, we want to walk through it in faithfulness. So tell us a little bit about your hopes and desires and plans for this Indo-Pakistani ministry and how that all came about. I don't know who's the best guy to start about how this started.
I'll jump in there because I was present on the first day when this started, and I'm comfortable enough with myself to let you know that this is a case of having very wrong impressions and being shown a much different direction than what you thought you were going into. We, for context, having a very small council with only 3 elders and 2 deacons and a minister, we help each other with our roles at times in line with what we find in the church order. And so I was assisting with a pastoral diaconal visit to Babar Masi and his family. And he's a refugee who is originally from Pakistan and spent many years in hiding in Thailand. And we were concerned about this family as new Canadians that wanted to make sure that their physical needs were being taken care of, because we had heard that he had difficulty with his employment. He was, as many immigrants do, doing some physical labor jobs and had some difficulties with doing his work and had no employment. So we went over to have a little visit and see how things were going. And myself and the deacon who was with me, we really learned something there. So we went in trying to figure out if we maybe could help him diaconally with their financial needs. And what we learned there is that this brother actually had pretty substantial experience and qualifications in the ministry. He had completed a Bible certificate, a Master of Divinity program, and another seminary program related to Reformed Presbyterian and Evangelical churches in Pakistan. And we asked him, wow, that's really interesting. We didn't know this about your background. What kind of work would you like to do? And he said, I just want to tell people about Jesus Christ. There's good news, and I want people to know this good news. So whatever gives me more opportunities to spread the gospel, that's what I want to do. So the deacon who was with me and I were just really kind of blown away by this and thinking, like, God is giving us an opportunity here. We have a new congregation in a rapidly growing city that has a substantial number of new arrivals every year from India and Pakistan. And he speaks fluent Punjabi and Urdu and a couple of other languages and has all this training. So we thought, how can we find a way to do something with this brother to help him to tell other people about Jesus? So that's something that we've been on a bit of a journey with as a congregation. And actually last night we had a council meeting and we've now moved beyond another step. He, Lord willing, will be ordained and installed as an elder in Refuge on Easter Sunday. And he was elected unanimous to that office. And also in our recent budget meeting, our congregation unanimously approved a budget, which has a pretty significant commitment to giving him some paid support to conduct that ministry work in a professional way. So not called as an ordained minister, but working as an elder to organize evangelism in that community. He's running a weekly Bible study and a number of regular events where they give hospitality to people and get together over food. And so there's a lot of other things we're exploring and what we can do next with that work. But it really was a case of, us trying to do one thing there and God showing us a completely different opportunity. And we initially engaged him to conduct some research on what's already out there as far as work with Punjabi speaking neighbors of ours. And what he found is that there were some organized missional activities in neighboring cities in Surrey and Abbotsford, but not specifically in Langley where we are focused. So that's something that, again, we got another pointer. Yes, he's the right person here at the right time to do work with Refuge. And a number of people are attending his Bible study regularly. And he also conducts Bible studies. The pandemic kind of opened some more different ways of thinking for us in a positive way. And he conducts a number of Bible studies with people who are actually in India and Pakistan and in Thailand, many of whom are persecuted for their faith. And he joins them on video calls and explains the Bible to them, and they encourage each other in prayer. So it's really exciting to be a part of this. And we had a few plans specifically how this can go and how that can go. And the numbers of people showing up on all these things are far beyond what we expected. So we've really learned, okay, God has something big planned with us. Let's just go with this and see where he leads us.
I can never remember the exact line from Dwight Eisenhower, but it's something like, planning is indispensable, but plans are useless. And you've got to go through the work of planning, but you have to be prepared for God to take you in a different direction. I love this story, and I love it in part because I think that the demographic of people in Canada most receptive to the gospel are immigrants. And the data bears this out. The evangelical church is growing in Canada from migrant and immigrant populations. And so I think we need to think explicitly about ways to reach these populations, because secularist Canadians, for whatever reason, think they understand Christianity and they've made a decision against it. They're just not that receptive to the gospel. It's very hard soil, shouldn't be ignored, but these immigrant populations are generally far more receptive. I'm kind of curious, though, why, and maybe you are, why you're not pursuing ordination as a pastor for this individual. Is that something you've contemplated? Is it just proving to be too difficult to jump through the hoops? I think it'd be wonderful to see this individual ordained as a minister in the Canadian Reformed churches and maybe be able to pastor a congregation in the future. I'm sure these are all questions you've asked, but why that decision to go the route of elder and not pastor?
Maybe you can add to this, Pastor Randall, but just in a nutshell, academic credentials are difficult to transfer to other countries in any field. And many new immigrants have that problem. They're qualified, for example, as, they have an MBA and they're a CEO in India, and they come to Canada and they're ended up being a shift manager at Tim Hortons, and their academic credentials that they got are not properly valued here or not able to transfer properly. And so the same thing happened here. In order to be qualified as a minister in a Canadian Reformed Church and complete our seminary training, there's just too many gaps with the type of training that he had. He fully embraces our doctrines as a Canadian Reformed Church. So there's no issue there. But the credentials that he has, it would be very challenging to go that route. It's not impossible. There would be a lot of study required. And we feel that the opportunity is there right now. God opened a door wide open for us. And we just feel that it would be hindering the work of the Holy Spirit if we put the brakes on that and said, okay, wait, yeah, we'll do this. But first, Brother Massey, we need to put you through 6 more years of training, and then we'll start the work. God gave us an opportunity right now. People are coming. People want to learn about Jesus. So we said, how can we just start working in a way that is church orderly, and that we can just get out of the way and let him tell people about Jesus and where we go next with it?
Let me interject here, and maybe Randall can comment on this. Well, I'm not sure he needs 6 years. If he's an ordained minister with a seminary education, all he needs in order to be examined by classis is a letter from the seminary saying he has fulfilled seminary equivalency. And that may mean that his existing education will need to be supplemented, but that can probably be done remotely. And I would think that within a year, that education can be brought up to snuff and he could go before classes. But Randall, what? Yeah.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it was something that was looked into. The seminary was contacted, but just due to the nature of the requirements that we have for our pastors, their judgment was effectively that they would expect him to just do the full 4-year. And I think for our brother, that just isn't a particularly attractive option. He wants to just be spreading the good news, and for him to uproot with his family, go to Hamilton, spend 4 years there, just so that he might, get called back by us to a formal ministry position, just isn't. Yeah.
And on top of that, on top of that, I just like your creative approach. There's other churches in our federation that hire staff to do various kinds of work, and why not be hiring staff to be doing outreach work? I think that's great. And then you have them as an ordained elder, and they're accountable to a consistory and all of that type of thing. I think that's a great creative approach that grabs the bull by the horns and walks through a door that the Lord has presented to you, and does it in faith, knowing that, hey, who knows what's going to happen in the future. I imagine there's so many beautiful things about this story, but then I can imagine you could sort of come up with a list of, concerns or things that could go awry. So, you got somebody who's working in another language that the majority of your existing members don't speak. You can imagine a scenario where it just sort of ends up being 2 silos, 2 very different kinds of things. And how do people in your church have any meaningful participation in what Brother Massey is doing? I don't know. You got any comments about that challenge?
Well, we're definitely encouraging the members to drop by the Bible study. It's true they won't understand, but there are a few who are kind of willing to sometimes translate. So, for example, last Sunday I was there, and one of our younger brothers did a bit of a translation for me, so I could kind of understand what's happening. And then, of course, afterwards they do, times of fellowship together. Sometimes it's just, tea and snacks. Other times it's full on meals. And then, obviously most of the people who are there do speak some English, some of them better than others. But so you can also get to know the members there. And yeah, we kind of hope that, with time going on, that there will be opportunities for the members of Refuge to be able to serve those who are also coming to that Bible study, talk of things like ESL classes, or just, finding other creative ways in which we can support them as, brothers and sisters in Christ.
Yeah, we're so used to, as Anglophones in Canada, to speaking one language and assuming everything can only run in one language. But I've been in numerous places in the world where people are attending to a congregation that is three different languages. I used to go to a church in West Africa where the pastor would preach in one language and two different people would simultaneously translate into two different other languages. So there's three languages being going on. They would do that. They would sing in three different languages, and that was just sort of a normal part of life and a permanent fixture. It wasn't like the goal was to get everybody into one language. So yeah, I can imagine if you're willing to sort of stretch yourself as a Canadian. We come from a background where it's like, our ancestors were Dutch, but they very quickly moved to English services and tried to become, have one language. But yeah, you can imagine a scenario where Refuge Church, you come and visit it in the future and it's got multiple languages being used in the worship service.
Yeah. I was going to mention that Brother Massey, like, even within the service he leads, it's primarily in Urdu, but he does go into at times into Punjabi and Hindi, which he's also familiar with, to kind of.
At Blessings, at Blessings, we have somebody translating what I'm saying into ordinary English as well. So it's a multilingual church. I would think creatively, and you're probably doing this, but ways to mobilize the congregation for this mission. Have games night where you don't need to be talking in English all the time. Maybe you could do career mentoring. Maybe you could play a part in providing lodging. I think this is an excellent thing, and your congregation is going to become very missional just from this exercise of interacting with this community. But I would think long and hard about ways to mobilize everybody to play some part in this, and it doesn't seem to be too much of a stretch to think of ways in which that might be done.
Yeah, and to make sure that it goes both ways, right? Like we had a church in Quebec that had about 50% of the people from Quebecois background, and the rest were from Madagascar background. And so they would have evenings together where they would share different elements of their culture and give a little talk about this element of their culture or that element of their culture. It's not just a matter of like, hey, let's mobilize the existing members of Refuge in order to help this new immigrant community, but what can they teach you about the faith and about walking with the Lord, especially those who have lived under persecution or have had to be refugees and whatnot. Wow, there's so much blessing that can pour both ways. Hey, gentlemen, this has been a really interesting conversation. It would be interesting perhaps to, in the future to get Brother Massey to come and speak with us on this podcast. That would be excellent. And it's just a beautiful story because your guys are only at the beginning of, really. The church has not been around for that long. You've decided to jump into this open door that the Spirit has opened for you. Can't wait to talk to you about it all in the future and see where the Lord leads all of this. So thank you so much for being on the podcast today. I really appreciate it. Thanks for coming. So, Bill, we started this podcast by talking about the necessity to walk through the doors that the Lord opens for you and follow the leading of the Holy Spirit. That was a little bit of a theme when we had our discussion with John Seebiga as well, in terms of the church there who said, hey, we've got somebody available. Let's use that and take advantage of that opportunity that God's given us. And Refuge Church has done something pretty similar. They've got, by God's grace and God's providence, they have somebody who's been placed in their church with a bunch of skills, and they've decided to say, hey, let's follow that. Let's, put resources behind that. So yeah, you got any comments about that? The necessity of following the Lord's lead in those things? And then maybe you could, I'd be interested in what you'd have to say to this. What's the difference between following the Lord's lead or to walk through the doors that the Spirit opens and just being entrepreneurial?
Yeah. Well, it's a great question. And, at Blessings, and perhaps you've done the same at Jubilee, we have a vision, mission, and strategic plan. And that's good and bad. I think Christians in whatever realm, whether it's business, family, church, need to be responsible, need to plan for the future, need to think in terms of the future. It was characteristic of the prophetic ministry to have vision for the future. And so I think we need, on the one hand, to target demographics and to commit to certain ministries as local churches. But at the same time, we always need to be open to the Lord's leading, to the Spirit opening doors that we didn't maybe even know existed. And, that kind of sensitivity to what God is doing in one's congregation and in one's community. And I love this about Refuge Church, that they had this gentleman in their community, and instead of ignoring him, they attended to him, heard his story, discovered he had education and gifts, and abilities for ministry, and then, set him free or emboldened him to do this kind of work. I think there's a lesson there that as leadership in particular, we need constantly to be asking the question, what is God doing in our congregation? What doors is he opening that we might not be seeing or that we weren't looking for? And then if you may be surprised what you discover. And I just really, really love the idea that the people at Refuge kind of ran with this, and I'm almost certain it is already bearing fruit, and I think it'll bear a lot of fruit.
Yeah. And if any of our listeners don't like the language of walking through open doors or following the lead of the Spirit, which is biblical language, the reformers, talked so much about providence and, and accepting where the Lord in his providence has placed you and asking for your daily bread in where the Lord has placed you, and where the Lord in his providence has, placed you, you go about doing your work. And so if the Lord in his providence has placed a desire, or a thought in your mind to say, hey, maybe we should go plant a church over there or start a new church, or he's given somebody in your congregation specific gifts, then let's celebrate that and run after that. The flip side of that, which you alluded to, was sort of careful planning. And you mentioned in the interview about the need or the opportunity here in Canada, at least, to reach out to new Canadians, to people who are new immigrants. So you said something along the lines of, that's where a lot of the growth in Christianity is happening. You want to say a couple words more about that? Like, do you think that this is something that we should be paying specific attention to?
Well, there are Angus Reid polls that demonstrate statistically that evangelical churches are growing because of immigrant populations. In Canada, we see a lot of immigration occurring, maybe not to the extent of Germany and some of these other countries, but in the city of Hamilton, for instance, we are projected to grow by 200,000 in the next 10 years. And they expect that almost 1 in 4 of newcomers to the city will be international students, their spouses, or families. From my own experience, East Asian populations are far more receptive to the gospel than secularist Canadians, whether they're from China or Japan. The story of Christianity is somewhat foreign to them. They're kind of intrigued, and you'll find a listening ear. And there are plenty of Chinese individuals who are converting to Christ here in Canada. The same I find is true of Middle Eastern immigrants, Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan. These are people often from Muslim backgrounds who are open to the gospel. A lot of Africans who come here are already professing Christians, but certainly not all, especially not from the north of Africa. I really think these are populations that we should target as churches, because for the most part, they simply are more open to hearing the gospel, hearing about Jesus in particular.
Yeah, I'd say that's so accurate. So many other cultures around the world, unlike our own secular Canadian culture, love speaking about religion, love speaking about God, are willing to have open conversations about that. You can be pretty sure that if you talk to any new Canadian who's from Asia or from Africa and you strike up a spiritual oriented conversation, that they're more than willing to have that. Whereas it seems super awkward to the secular Canadian to have that discussion, which sort of, you imagine, that impulse to do that as churches continues to grow. We've got multiple churches in Canada in our federation that are reaching out to new Canadians, or that are seeing a portion of their population being people that are new to Canada. Yeah, we need to get a whole bunch of people together to talk about what that looks like, and the lessons that we can be learning from there, because I can imagine you've got the situation of two silos growing up. You've got situations where congregations become more integrated cross-culturally. You've got congregations that are just willing to see what happens. There's got to be so much interesting learning that can happen there. Maybe we should do that as a podcast or a conference or something, get people together who are involved in ministering to new Canadians. That would be super interesting.
I think it would be. I mentioned the Angus Reid pollsters. Well, Cardis, and we've interviewed Ray Pennings from Cardis on Tyrannus Hall earlier, will be releasing data about religion in Canada this coming summer. The data's already in. They're busy interpreting now. But I heard Ray Pennings speak this past weekend, and among the the data or the facts that he disclosed is another interesting development, and that is that young people between, let's say, the ages of 18 and 25 are far more likely to read a religious text in the course of a week than someone 60 or older. So there's also a shift occurring in terms of younger people being open and interested in religion that you don't find with boomers in Canada. I just think that's very encouraging for Canadians and for Canadian Christians, in a climate where there's so much bad news. There are some interesting things happening.
Yeah, fascinating. Proverbs says that, man makes the plans, but it's the Lord that establishes his steps. That's been true for Refuge Church. That's true for the whole Church of Jesus Christ. We keep on making our plans and we keep on trusting God with the results. And that's true for all of you who are listening to us today, or all those who are viewing this on video. Keep on making your good plans to make the mission of Jesus Christ your passion, every church's mission, and keep on trusting the Lord that he'll establish your steps. Thanks so much, Bill. Let's see you next time.
Thank you, Winston. Take care.